Ryan's office revenge.
I knew the axe was falling the day Rever forgot to invite me to the safety protocol meeting I created. Picture this minus it's 9:15. Monday morning, I'm drinking black coffee from my old USS Enterprise mug, checking emails before our monthly defense compliance review. The one I've run for 7 straight years without missing a beat. I click the meeting link. Nothing. My calendar again. Crickets. Then Jessica from procurement messages me. Hey Will, did Trevor mean to leave you off the invite? That's when you hear the funeral march starting to play. My name's William Rodriguez, but everyone calls me Will. I'm 49, been Director of Defense Compliance at Hoffman Defense Systems for the past 7 years. Before that, 22 years in the Navy making sure our sailors got home safe. Joined up at 20, served until I was 42, then transitioned to civilian life protecting our troops from behind a desk instead of a ship. Let me set the scene here. I wasn't running marketing campaigns or sitting in boardrooms talking about innovation and disruption. I was the guy making sure the armor plating we shipped to Afghanistan could actually stop a bullet. I tracked material certifications. I flagged substandard components. I logged every safety test like lives depended on it because they did. It wasn't glamorous work. No fancy conferences or executive retreats with champagne and networking. I had the trust of Oliver Hoffman, our CEA, the Pentagon Procurement Office, and even our engineering team minus, which says something since they once named a testing protocol after me as a joke. The Rodriguez standard they called it, meaning if we'll sign off on it, it was bulletproof. Here's the thing that civilians don't understand about defense contracting minus documentation doesn't just save your career. It saves lives. I kept everything. Not because I was paranoid, but because when you're building equipment for Marines in Fallujah or Navy SCILS in the South China Sea, there's no tech support hotline when things go wrong. There's just a 19-year-old kid from Ohio hoping his radio works when mortars start falling. We made communication systems that had to function in 130-degree heat and sandstorms. Armor plating for vehicles that needed to stop armor-piercing rounds. Maintenance parts for helicopters flying medical evacuations under fire. When something fails in those situations, people die. Not anonymous statistics, minus actual American sons and daughters who joined up to serve their country. Oliver understood that reality. He'd been in Vietnam as a young lieutenant, knew what it meant when gear failed in the field. Lost 3 guys in his squad to a radio malfunction during a nighttime patrol in 1971st. He never forgot that, and neither did I. Every quarter, we'd review our compliance standards together. Not because regulations required it, but because both of us had friends who didn't come home. And we'd be damned if it was because we cut corners on safety. The systems we built at Hoffman had multiple layers of protection. Material certifications required to engineering signatures plus my approval. Quality control tests couldn't be fast-tracked, or bypassed every component got tested under combat conditions before shipping. Safety protocols were written in stone, documented in triplicate, reviewed by legal. Nothing moved without proper authorization. I documented everything religiously, not to cover myself legally, but because when the inevitable day came and working in defense contracting long enough, do you know it always comes I needed to prove I hadn't been asleep at the wheel protecting American troops overseas. The accountability chain was crystal clear. Engineers designed to spec, manufacturing built to standard, quality control tested everything, and I verified compliance before anything got a shipping label. Oliver called it our zero-defect culture, and it worked. In 7 years, we'd never had a field failure traced back to manufacturing defects or safety shortcuts. Then came Trevor, Oliver's son, fresh out of Stanford Business School with an MBA in disruption and zero understanding of what we actually did for the defense of this country. First thing he said in our introduction meeting was, "So what's your ROI on all these compliance processes?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Soldiers coming home alive instead of in flag-draped coffins." He didn't laugh. Didn't even blink. Just made a note on his tablet like he was calculating the profit margin on patriotism. That should have been my first warning sign, but I figured Oliver would straighten him out once the kid understood the business. Defense contracting isn't like selling smartphones or social media apps. You can't move fast and break things when the things you break are keeping Marines alive in combat zones. 3 weeks after Trevor started shadowing Oliver in executive meetings, the old man had his heart attack. Massive stress minus induced cardiac event, doctor said. Not surprising given what we were dealing with at the time. Pentagon audit of our Q3 deliveries. Quality issues with a batch of communication equipment that had to be recalled from to forward operating basis. Budget pressures from new contracts requiring us to bid lower than our normal safety margins would allow. One day Oliver is on a conference call with DoD procurement discussing material specifications. Next day he's in cardiac surgery getting a triple bypass while fighting for his life. That afternoon, the company-wide email went out with corporate efficiency. Leadership update: Trevor Hoffman assumes acting COO responsibilities during Oliver's medical leave. Please direct all operational questions through the new chain of command. Translation: the third eye for -year-old kid with Zaro military experience now controlled a company that made life-or-death equipment for American soldiers in harm's way. I should have seen the writing on the wall right then. Within 48 hours, Trevor started swinging his new authority like a sledgehammer at a precision instrument. First casualty was our weekly safety reviews minus the meetings where we'd go through every component failure, every quality control flag, every near-miss that could have gotten someone killed downrange. I found out when my calendar invite got auto-declined with a note streamlining operations for efficiency. Efficiency. That's what this Stanford MBA called canceling meetings designed to keep American soldiers alive. I walked down to his office minus my old conference room that he'd already redecorated with motivational posters about velocity and disruptive thinking. Found him on a video call with some venture capital guys, explaining how defense contracting was ripe for innovation and how his father's generation had been to risk-averse to achieve scale. To risk-averse. He was talking about the man who'd built this company from nothing after Vietnam, who'd never shipped a single piece of equipment that hadn't been tested to destruction first. When he finished his call, I knocked on the doorframe. Trevor, we need to talk about the safety review cancellation. He looked up from his laptop with that patient smile people give you when they think you're missing the bigger picture. Well, I appreciate your attention to detail, but we're moving to a more agile framework. Those meetings were consuming 8 hours of engineering time every 2 weeks. That's 200 hours per quarter. We can redirect to actual production. Those meetings prevent defective equipment from reaching combat zones, and our quality control systems catch defects at the source. We're not eliminating safety, we're optimizing the process. I wanted to explain that quality control systems only work if people use them correctly. That shortcuts have a way of becoming standard procedures when nobody's watching. That the 19-year-old Marine using our equipment in Syria doesn't care about our quarterly efficiency metrics minus. He just wants his radio to work when he's calling for medevac. Instead, I said, what about the materials certification reviews with legal? Also being streamlined. Legal will review specifications during the contract phase, then trust our engineering team to execute properly. No more redundant check-ins. Redundant. That's what he called the process that ensured we weren't substituting cheaper materials that looked identical on paper but failed under combat stress. I didn't argue, just nodded and walked back to my office where I opened a new folder on my encrypted doctor-labeled process changes documentation. Started with screenshots of the canceled meeting invitations, copies of Trevor's efficiency memos, timestamps showing when safety protocols got modified without engineering review. Not because I was planning anything specific, just because my Navy training taught me to document everything when command structure starts breaking down. The next week brought more changes. Trevor disbanded the joint review board between engineering and compliance minus the monthly session where we'd go through test results together, flag potential issues, coordinate responses to Pentagon feedback. When I asked him about it, he gave me 3 words that made my blood pressure spike: bureaucratic red tape. Read tape. That's what this trust fund kid called the processes that ensured a Marine's body armor, could stop shrapnel from an IED, and the Navy SEAL's communication gear wouldn't fail during an extraction operation behind enemy lines. Trevor, I said, keeping my voice level. Few for deliveries require coordinated safety sign-offs between engineering and compliance. Pentagon regulations aren't suggestions. He leaned back in Oliver's old chair, minus the one with the bronze nameplate that still said Oliver Hoffman, CEO minus, and gave me the condescending look I'd started seeing more often. Will, you're doing great work, really. But let's be honest here. My father gave you a very generous title during a different era of this company. I need people who execute solutions, not people who create roadblocks to progress. That sentence hit like taking shrapnel to the chest. My entire job was preventing roadblocks, minus the kind that get soldiers killed when equipment fails in firefights. But to Trevor, protecting American troops was just an impediment to maximizing quarterly profit margins. I didn't respond immediately. Just stood there processing what I'd heard, adding it to the mental file cabinet I was building. Because guys like Trevor always hang themselves with their own words eventually. They just can't help bragging about how smart they think they are. Understood, I finally said, and walked away. That night, I started working late. Not because I had extra assignments, but because I wanted quiet time on the systems after the building emptied out. Time when nobody was looking over my shoulder or asking why I was accessing certain databases. I began copying files systematically. Safety test results that showed material failures. Quality control reports that had been overridden without proper authorization. Material certification documents that had been modified after legal review. Email chains showing Trevor's team pushing equipment through production phases without completing required testing protocols. Everything got tagged with metadata, encrypted, and backed up to an external drive I kept in my laptop bag like a life preserver. I wasn't being paranoid, minus I was preparing for the inevitable impact. Because when a spoiled rich kid starts dismantling infrastructure designed to protect American soldiers in combat zones, it's not a question of if the system fails. It's when. The atmosphere in the building started changing too. People were walking on eggshells, having hushed conversations in break rooms, avoiding eye contact in hallways. Trevor had brought in some consultants from McKinsey to do organizational efficiency assessments, minus corporate speak for figuring out who to fire next. I noticed I was being excluded from more meetings. First it was the vendor review sessions I'd attended for 7 years, then the Pentagon liaison calls where we discussed contract modifications. Finally, the executive briefings where we reviewed upcoming deliverables and potential compliance issues. When I asked Jessica about it, she just shrugged apologetically. Trevor said those meetings needed to be limited to essential personnel only. Sorry, Will. Essential personnel. I was the guy who made sure our equipment wouldn't get American soldiers killed, but apparently that wasn't essential to Trevor's vision of the company. I kept documenting everything. Meeting invitations I didn't receive, email chains I got removed from, authorization codes that bypassed my approval requirements, digital breadcrumbs showing a systematic effort to eliminate compliance, oversight from production decisions. The breaking point came during a helicopter parts inspection that should have been routine. A batch of communication components destined for marine aviation units in Syria, minus stuff that needed to work perfectly when pilots were calling for close air support under fire. The initial quality control tests flagged 12% failure rate under stress conditions. In civilian terms, that might be acceptable. In military terms, it meant dead Marines. Standard protocol required engineering to redesign the components, retest everything, then get my sign-off before shipping. Instead, I discovered Trevor had used emergency authorization codes to override the testing requirements and ship the parts anyway. Found out through a forwarded email chain that Jessica accidentally included me on. I walked straight to his office. Trevor, we need to talk about the marine aviation shipment. He looked up from his laptop with obvious irritation. What about it? You authorized shipping communications equipment that failed stress testing. That's a direct violation of Pentagon safety protocols. The failure rate was within acceptable parameters for the contract specifications. The contract specifications assume 100% functionality under combat conditions. A 12% failure rate means 12% of those Marines might not be able to call for air support when they need it. Trevor closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. Will, I appreciate your attention to detail, but you're being unnecessarily risk-averse here. Those components will function adequately for their intended purpose. Their intended purpose is keeping Marines alive in combat zones. Their intended purpose is fulfilling our contractual obligations while maintaining profitability. We can't spend unlimited money chasing theoretical perfection. Theoretical perfection. That's what he called ensuring American soldiers had reliable equipment in firefights. I didn't trust myself to respond professionally, so I just walked out. But that night, I documented everything. The failed test results, the override codes Trevor used, the email authorization chain showing he personally approved shipping defective equipment to active combat units. Most importantly, I traced the digital fingerprints. Trevor's executive access codes were all over the authorization system. By passing safety protocols during blackout testing windows when normal oversight wasn't active, he was systematically using his administrative privileges to push questionable equipment through production without proper review. 3 weeks later came the announcement that killed any remaining doubt about where this was heading. Compliance Initiative 2.0- Trevor's rebranding of compliance emanation disguised as operational improvement. The presentation was everything you'd expect from a Stanford MBA who'd never spent a day in uniform. Buzzwords like agile methodologies, risk-positive frameworks, charts showing how much money we could save by streamlining redundant oversight processes, a slide deck that treated safety protocols like bureaucratic waste instead of systems designed to prevent American casualties. Buried on slide 14 was a list titled Organizational Restructuring Opportunities. My position was listed second, right after Policy Oversight Analyst minus another compliance role that would be transitioned to operational efficiency. People started treating me differently after that presentation. Not hostile, just careful. Like I was carrying something contagious that they didn't want to catch. Colleagues who used to stop by my office for coffee and shop talk started communicating through formal emails. It was radioactive, and everyone could hear the Geiger counter clicking louder every day. But I stayed calm and professional. I'd been through reorganizations before in the Navy. Watched officers get rotated out when their leadership style didn't match the current operational tempo. Usually the pendulum swings back eventually when reality reasserts itself. This felt different though. Trevor wasn't just cutting perceived fat minus, he was removing safety nets intentionally. Like he wanted to see how close to disaster he could push things before something broke. So I intensified my documentation efforts, stayed late every night, using the quiet hours when security was minimal to access systems and copy files. Safety test results showing systematic quality control failures. Materials certification reports with forged engineering signatures. Authorization logs proving Trevor personally bypassed safety requirements on equipment heading to combat zones. Everything got tagged with military precision, encrypted 6 layers deep, and backed up to multiple external drives. I kept one drive in my car, another in a safety deposit box, and a main working copy in my laptop bag. I wasn't being paranoid. I was applying lessons learned from 22 years of military service about preparation and redundancy. Because when command structure breaks down, the people who survive are the ones who saw it coming and took appropriate defensive measures. The termination meeting wasn't scheduled, of course. Trevor waited until our regular Friday executive wrap minus obsession to drop the hammer. Walked in carrying a protein shake and wearing that kind of smug confidence you only get from knowing you hold all the cards. We went through the normal agenda items minus production schedules, Pentagon feedback, upcoming contract deadlines. Then, just as people were starting to pack up their laptops, Trevor made his announcement. Before we adjourn, he said, closing his computer like he was ending a TED talk nobody asked for. I have one personnel update. Will Rodriguez, our Director of Defense Compliance, will be transitioning out of the organization effective immediately. The silence was deafening. Just the sound of chairs creaking as people shifted uncomfortably, not sure if they'd heard correctly. Trevor kept talking, making eye contact with each person like he expected applause for his decisive leadership. Let's be completely honest here. Will's position doesn't align with our current operational philosophy. We're not living in 1995 anymore. We're not begging Pentagon bureaucrats for permission to innovate. We're building solutions for the modern battlefield, not creating administrative bottlenecks. He looked directly at me with that sales minus bitch gleam in his eyes. You've had a good run. Well, but you're essentially a relic from my father's era. Time to embrace the future. Relic. That word cut deep. Not because it was cruel, but because it revealed exactly who Trevor really was underneath the MBA buzzwords. A spoiled trust fund kid who saw protecting American troops as outdated thinking that got in the way of quarterly profit targets. I didn't flinch. Didn't give him the satisfaction of a dramatic reaction or emotional outburst. Just took a slow breath, closed my notebook, and stood up with the same composure I'd learned during 22 years of military service. Understood, I said calmly. Nothing more. I walked out of that conference room to complete silence. Nobody followed. And I didn't expect them to. That's the thing about being the safety net minus people only notice you when they're already falling. Back at my desk, I packed nothing personal. Left my Navy coffee mug, my commendation photos, even the challenge coin from my old commanding officer sitting on the bookshelf. What I took was my encrypted doctor, labeled innocuously as Q for safety reviews, but containing something much more valuable than Trevor could imagine. Inside that doctor lived everything he thought he'd buried. Material test results showing substandard armor plating that passed inspection through forged signatures. Quality control bypasses on communication equipment authorized through Slack emoji, IS instead of proper documentation. Safety protocols modified without engineering review, just pushed through production with backdated timestamps to make them look legitimate. Most damning was the digital paper trail leading directly to Trevor's executive access codes. His electronic fingerprints were all over authorization systems used to override safety requirements during blackout testing windows. The helicopter parts destined for Marine units in Syria. Communication gear heading to Army forward operating bases in Iraq. Equipment that could fail when American soldiers needed it most. All personally approved by a Stanford MBA who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. That night, I sat on my back porch with a beer and my laptop, looking at the Department of Defense Inspector General whistleblower portal, like it was a loaded weapon. Which, in a way, it was. I didn't rush the submission. Organized everything in logical batches that told the story methodically. Material certification violations minus 47 documents showing systematic substitution of substandard components. Quality control bypasses minus authorization logs proving Trevor personally approved shipping defective equipment. Safety protocol modifications minus policy changes made without legal review or engineering sign-off. The final folder, I named Command Responsibility. It traced every safety compromise back to Trevor's executive decisions, his authorization codes on systems designed to protect American lives, his digital signature on equipment heading to combat zones where failure meant casualties. I attached no editorial comments or angry manifestos. The evidence spoke for itself. Dates showing patterns of systematic violations. Digital signatures proving personal involvement. Communication records showing Trevor knew the risks and approved them anyway to meet profit targets and delivery schedules. At 11:47 p.m., I clicked submit. The confirmation screen appeared like an answered prayer. Your submission has been received. Preliminary review in progress. Case number DOD-IG-2020 for 1847th. I closed the laptop and went inside. Poured myself a glass of water and stood in my dark kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum and thinking about my son currently stationed in Iraq, potentially using equipment that companies like ours built to keep him alive. I felt no immediate satisfaction or dramatic vindication. Just the quiet certainty of someone who'd been professionally executed but kept the ammunition for the counterstrike. For the first week, I checked that confirmation portal obsessively. Nothing but automated status updates. By the second week, I stopped looking entirely. Instead, I watched Trevor's public relations machine kick into high gear. He launched something called Operation Velocity Minus, his rebranding of compliance elimination that sounded like an actual Pentagon operation. The company blog posted articles about modernizing defense innovation and eliminating bureaucratic friction. Industry publications ran interviews where Trevor talked about his risk-minus positive approach to military contracting. One LinkedIn post showed him shaking hands with a defense industry reporter, captioned, "Finally, a defense executive who understands that speed saves lives." The irony was perfect minus speed that potentially cost lives through eliminated safety checks. I screenshot everything and added it to my documentation files. Because if this investigation got buried in bureaucratic processes, I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining the corporate insanity I'd witnessed. 3 weeks after my submission, the first real contact came. Not an automated message, but an actual email from senior investigator Sarah Mitchell at the Duty Inspector General's office. Subject line clarification requested minus authorization protocol documentation. Professional and clinical, but specific enough to prove someone had actually read my submission. She wanted elaboration on the safety override system I documented, particularly the authorization codes used to bypass quality control during the Syrian helicopter parts incident. I spent 4 hours crafting my response with military precision. No emotional language, just facts. Code sequences. Decision reads, plain English explanations of how safety flags had been systematically bypassed. Digital forensics showing Trevor's personal involvement in every major violation. 2 weeks later, she called directly. "Rodriguez, this is Investigator Mitchell. Are you available for a phone consultation regarding your submission?" We talked for 52 minutes. Professional questions about authorization protocols, material certification chains, executive override procedures. Questions that could only come from someone who'd traced the digital breadcrumbs I'd left and found something prosecutable. When she thanked me and hung up, I knew the fuse had reached the explosive charge. For days later, Jessica texted me at 9:23 a.m. "Holy shit, Will. Federal agents are in the building. FBI badges, duty investigators, the whole 9 yards. Trevor's been working remotely for 3 days. Oliver's back from medical leave and he looks ready to kill someone." I set down my coffee and walked outside, stood in my driveway breathing cool morning air and listening to normal suburban sounds. Lawnmowers, dogs barking, kids waiting for school buses. My phone buzzed again. They're auditing the safety review files. The ones you used to manage. Brought printed copies of everything, Will. In color. They highlighted the important parts. In color. I nearly laughed out loud. That evening, Oliver called me directly. His voice sounded older, worn down by surgery and whatever federal investigators had shown him that day. "Will, we need to talk." I didn't know what Trevor was doing. The shortcuts, the overrides, the equipment he pushed through without proper testing. A long pause. "I should have kept you in the loop before my surgery. I understand, Oliver. The Pentagon's reviewing all our contracts. The board wants to offer you your position back, plus promotion to VP of Defense Compliance. Full authority to rebuild every safety protocol Trevor eliminated. I thought about my son's unit in Iraq, potentially using equipment that had passed through compromised quality control. About Marines in Syria depending on communication gear that might fail during firefights. I'll consider it. But I have conditions. Full audit of everything Trevor touched. Public commitment to restoring every eliminated safety protocol. Complete transparency with duty investigators. Done. 6 months later, Trevor Hoffman was indicted on federal charges related to defense contract fraud and endangering national security. Hoffman Defense Systems paid a $15 million fine and accepted enhanced oversight for all military contracts. It took the VP position and rebuilt our compliance systems stronger than before. Last month, a Marine captain wrote thanking our company for communication equipment that worked perfectly during a complex evacuation under fire in Syria. That letter sits framed in my office now, next to my Navy commendation. Because sometimes the best revenge is just ensuring the right people see the truth, especially when American lives depend on it. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at our troops overseas minus. It's the one in the boardroom cutting corners on their equipment to boost quarterly profits. Experience isn't just about knowing what to do minus, it's about having the patience to document everything and the backbone to act when corporate cowards think nobody's watching.